It's time to increase your bankroll by decreasing your daily fantasy sports learning curve. The Curve with Benny Ricciardi and Josh Kalashi starts now.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Curve here at rotocurve.com, where our mission is to help you accelerate your DFS learning curve and get you over that hump of profitability. My name is Benny Ricciardi. I go by BRich11 on all the daily fantasy sites, and I'm here with my partner and co-host, Josh Kalachi. Josh, how we doing today, bud?
Doing great. It's Chris Bryant Day, everybody. Chris Bryant got called up. He's batting fourth. Playing for the Cubs. It's the early slate. Now, obviously, we talk about the late slate every day, but he's up. He's finally up. It's Christmas time.
Well, let me ask you the big question then. Are you using them today? Because that's the important thing.
Yeah, and that early slate at 2 o'clock, there's not many options. You might as well go for it, right? If he goes 0 for 3, you still have Chris Bryant in the lineup.
Now, we were actually talking about it before the show. What do you think the likelihood is that he goes 0 for 3 today and then hits 2 donks tomorrow when nobody's on him?
Well, that's definitely, I think, the sure likelihood, just because that's baseball. I mean, that's how it works every day. He doesn't really have a bad matchup today. I think he's going against James Shields, but you never know. It's baseball. He'll hit 3 home runs in a game where you don't expect it.
Yep, that's always the way it works. So we got a big show lined up for you guys today. Going to go through what we're going to go over. We're going to start, as we always do, with the recap. Then we're going to go on to the weather for today, any issues and concerns. There are a couple that I know I had looked at already. We'll get into the Vegas line, see what Vegas thinks about the games today, see if it points out anything that we may need to be aware of before we start building our rosters. And today we actually have a special Q&A mailbag. We had a lot of questions that have been getting thrown to Josh and myself, as well as straight through to the RotoCurve site and the RotoCurve Twitter page. So we figured we'd take some time to put them all together and go through and answer them all for you, give our ideas on some of the things that you guys are worried about. So if you have any more of those, feel free to post them here in chat as well, or try to throw them up on Twitter, and if we have a chance, we'll try to get to as many of them as we can today. But after that, we're going to get into what we usually do. We're going to go over some pitchers that Josh and I like. Then we're going to go on to some of the hitters that we like. And then, as we always do, we'll end the show with giving you guys our ideas on how we're building our rosters today, what guys are the must-haves, what guys are the cornerstones that we're trying to build around. And, we'll go on from there. So before we get into today, though, Josh, you want to go over a little bit about some of the lineups from yesterday and some of the winning construction and what you saw from the tournaments you played in?
Yeah, it was a difficult day because there were only just 4 games in the late slate. A lot of guys got hurt. I know Jose Reyes got hurt running the first. He hurt his ribs. That's a big goose egg that was tough for some people to take. Jose Bautista had a 0 as well. He was up with the bases loaded late in the game. Could have done some damage and pushed a lot more people over the cash line. Evan Longoria also got hurt, so keep an eye on those guys going forward. For the rest of the night, Madison Bumgarner got hit around a little bit. Paul Goldschmidt's home run was huge. I know a lot of people were on him last night. It pushed the cash line up to just over about 98 points in most cash games. Giancarlo had another big day. Archie Bradley was denied of a win, which makes, I think, between the two of us, the pitchers we've been on past couple of days, pitched very well, but can't get that win. It's up to those bullpens to carry it over. Win, unfortunately, is not the greatest pitching stat in baseball, but it's something we still have to target in daily fantasy, so you still have to go after it. But the big play yesterday was Chris Archer against the Blue Jays, who are one of the best offenses in one of the best offensive parks. But Archer had about 37 fantasy points, I believe, on DraftKings, which is not a lot of people were on him, but if you were, you definitely cashed.
Yeah, Archer, that was a tough park for me. That's kind of why I faded away from him, but I did like him as well. He's a solid pitcher. Whenever I can get him in a good park and a good matchup, I would take him. Yesterday was not one of those days to me, but he did pitch really well, and he surprised me. Now, I know I'm looking out my window here. There's some little bit of rain outside my window. I'm in the New York area. Do you have any other weather issues? I'm guessing that Mets game tonight is probably one of them, right?
Yeah, definitely. There's 2 games right now that looks like could be an issue because of the weather. It's the Marlins at the Mets. Rain is about 80% chance right now. Obviously, anything can change, but with all the water up there, with the rivers and the lakes up in New York, sometimes that water can just come back and then it just becomes a storm that just stays stationary. So you want to keep an eye on that. And there's another game. It's Oakland against Kansas City Royals. It's about a 70% chance of rain. Obviously, that's a different time zone than us, so you might have to keep an eye on what time those games start, because if that's the 8 o'clock start, which I believe it is, you're limited for the options you can pivot away from. What we talk about with pivoting, if you read the glossary that's up on our site, pivot is a move from one player to the next based on certain factors, based on if you want to stay away from a certain guy. So if you have those guys in your lineup, as you're playing on late swap sites like DraftKings, be sure to have a backup plan, because those weather guys, if they get a 0, it crushes your cash game lineups. There's not really any wind that could affect a game. I usually target games that have 10-mile-an-hour wind blowing out or in. There's no wind issues at the moment. Obviously, that could change, so keep an eye on that. The weather is just one factor I use for my lineups, but there's another factor that's huge, and it's been a success so far this year, and that's the Vegas lines. What do you see today, Benny?
There's actually a couple interesting things. As I said, we usually start with the games that have the least runs expected, and I wanted to bring up something that Wrath hit on this morning in his DFS Minute. When you're looking at the Vegas lines, you have to remember that there's 2 pitchers on each side of a game. So sometimes a line might look a little high to you, or it might look a little low to you. But if you look at one of those pitchers, and one of those pitchers is a guy who you're figuring is going to limit the other team to 1 or 2 runs, then basically what they're thinking is that offense is going to wind up getting 6 or 7 runs, and the other team's offense is only going to get 1 or 2, and that's how they're going to get to a number like 7 or 8. So the reason why I bring that up is today the line in the Colorado and LA Dodger game is 6.5. It's one of the 2 lowest lines that we have on the day. And when you look at it, you're saying to yourself, I think Kyle Kendricks is starting for Colorado. Is that right? Kendricks going for Colorado?
It's Kendrick against Kershaw. It's going to be interesting.
And that's what makes the line so low today, because they're pretty much figuring that even against a lineup like Colorado, Kershaw is probably a guy who's going to give up 2 runs or less. So when you look at a line of 6.5 there, it's really like a line. If you're looking and saying, oh well, I can't take bats from the Dodgers, it's only a 6.5. The line on that one's only 6.5. Really, they're probably thinking that the Dodgers are going to wind up with 4 or 5 runs, like most of the other teams who have a line of 7 or 8 on their games. Basically, the difference is that they're thinking Kershaw is going to be the guy who can limit Colorado to maybe 2 runs. So when you see a low line like that, it doesn't automatically mean that you can't use the team. You got to take a peek at who the pitchers are and figure out what Vegas is really thinking. We'll get into it in a little bit, but you'll see that Kershaw is such a huge favorite in this game. Vegas is basically thinking that it's going to be like maybe a 4-1 game or maybe a 5-1 game, something like that. The other low-run expected game is Cincinnati and St. Louis, that's one of the late games, right? Yeah, Cincinnati and St. Louis. Good pitching matchup in this one. Johnny Cueto and Michael Wacha going up against each other. Both of those guys are guys that I think people are going to have some good exposure to tonight. It's a good pitcher's park in St. Louis. There's a lot of positives in that game. I definitely see how it could be 6.5 on the total. Both of those guys are really good pitchers. They could both limit the other offense, and neither one of those offenses are really knocking the ball out of the park at this point in the season. They're both solid. They both have a couple good hitters in them, but 1 to 8, neither one of them is really setting the world on fire. As for the games that the most runs are expected, these are the ones that we do want to target our hitters in. This Baltimore-Boston game is one that I had been looking at. There's a couple guys going there. I don't believe that Jimenez is going to go out there and throw another gem. Joe Kelly is a decent pitcher, but he's no world beater. So that Baltimore-Boston game up in Fenway Park should see some runs there. So there should be some bats from that game that we wouldn't mind using. Also, the Houston and LA Angels game. Both of those games have 8.5 run totals. So they're 2 of the bigger ones on the day. 2 of the ones where we should see a lot of runs scored. So that's a place that we should be looking to target against. I have heard people already talking about both Houston bats and LA Angels bats, so that could turn into a back and forth high scoring game. Then the last one that's at 8 runs today is Cleveland and Minnesota. And again, this is another one like we talked about with Colorado and the LA Dodgers. Corey Kluber is going for Cleveland. He's a pretty big favorite. He's a very good pitcher. So even though that there's an 8-run total in that game, they're probably only figuring Kluber for maybe 2 or 3 runs, which means that you got to figure that Cleveland offense is going to be able to get 5 or 6 runs off of Mike Pelfrey, and that's why they're putting the total up there that high. So Cleveland is definitely a sneaky team that you should be looking to try to find some bats from today. Pelfrey actually just got called back up. He lost out on the 5th starter job to Tommy Milone. I'm not sure how they say that name. So he just got called up because of a couple injuries that they had. So he's definitely not a guy who's been pitching well. He had a couple decent seasons with the Mets a few years back, but lately he's been getting beat up a little bit. So he might be a guy to look to target against as well. And then getting on to the favorites of the day, if you're looking for guys on the mound who have the best chance and the highest likelihood of a win, we have a couple really big favorites today. Kershaw is minus 280, which I think is the highest one I've seen so far this season. Not the highest one I've ever seen, but it's pretty up there. I mean, minus 280 is basically making Kershaw a 3-1 favorite to win that game today. Not far behind him is also Max Scherzer. Scherzer's a minus 240 favorite on the day today. He's a little bit cheaper than Kershaw, I think, on all the sites. So, they're both, more than 2.5 times as likely to win that game as they are to lose it. So you want to keep that in mind when you're looking at it. And then the last guy that we have is Corey Kluber, who we just mentioned. He's a minus 170 favorite. And like I said, don't let that 8-run scare you away there. They're still probably only expecting Kluber for 2 or 3. The reason that is so high is because everyone's expecting Pelfrey to give up a ton of runs, and then that bullpen to give up a couple more once they get in there. So that's the way the Vegas lines are for today. Before we get into the players for today, though, like I said, we had a couple questions that people had thrown to us on Twitter. So Josh and I had put together a few of those questions, and we're gonna go through them and kind of give you guys the answers. Some of them take a little bit more than 140 characters for us to answer, so we figured that this would be the best way to do it for you. So, Josh, you want to get into the first question that we got from some of our users, and we'll give them our answers?
Yeah, first question came yesterday from Scott Vogelson. He asked, it's a great question, something that it's a debate pretty much in every daily fantasy sport, especially in baseball, is he asked, when should we get cute with a lineup, or when to play it safe? Is it a gut check? For me, Scott, personally, I only tinker with lineups if there's new information available. The reason why is because you spend your research doing all night the night before, all morning, and you pick the guys that you like, you pick the guys that you don't like. The only reason to tinker with the lineups for me is if there's new info, because then you just go away from the research. If you spent a few hours looking up why to play one guy or play another guy, if you tinker, it throws all that research out of the window. I'm not sure exactly what Benny does, but I have a feeling it's something similar.
Yeah, there's very few times. I mean, most of them, I would say probably about 75 or 80% of my lineup, the cornerstones of the guys that I definitely want to use are set, and I pretty much leave them in there. I mean, it would take something like a rain out in one of the games that they're playing, or maybe a pitcher switch, or something that doesn't happen all that often for me to take those guys out. But there's always maybe 2 or 3 guys in my lineup that I'm not. I mean, I put them in there because they fit price-wise or because they were the best option I saw at the time, but I'm not really in love with. Those 2 or 3 guys I may wind up changing a couple times throughout the day. But also, I mean, when you say get cute with the lineup and play it safe, here's the other thing that I'll tell you. Here, and today's actually a really good example of, why this happens. In my cash games, I never get cute. I just play it safe, and that's the point of cash games, is to play it safe. Take the guy who is most likely to do what you think you need him to do, and to get you those points that are going to get you to that number you need in order to cash in your cash games. So whenever I'm playing cash games, there's no reason to get cute in a cash game. I say to people all the time, oh, he's going to be highly owned. So what? In a cash game, if a guy's highly owned, you want him. You don't want to fade him, because then you're going to stay up. There's probably a good reason why he's highly owned. Probably a good matchup, probably a good split, probably a good ballpark. So you don't want to really mess around with that. But when you say getting cute, that's what GPPs are for. In a GPP, you can't just go with all the chalk plays and expect to win, because everybody else is going to have those same plays as well. Now, in a cash game, it doesn't matter if a guy is really that highly owned. But when you say get cute, like today's a day where on DraftKings, Troy Tulowitzki's price is only 4,100. Now, it's only 4,100 because he's going up against Clayton Kershaw. And basically, Tulowitzki is a guy who mashes left-handed pitching. Kershaw has been a guy who's been struggling a little bit. So when you say getting cute, I mean, today I might get cute and use Tulowitzki in some of my GPP lineups. But when you're talking about when it's time to do a gut check and when it's time to play it safe, if you're playing cash games, you want to play it safe. If you're playing in a GPP and you want to get cute with it, fine, because there are some things that you're going to need to do differently than the crowd in order to win those games. But in a cash game, there's no reason not to play it safe. That's the way I look at it.
It's a great point, and when we are referring to these cash games and these 50-50s, those head-to-heads, GPPs are those big tournaments, and that's exactly what Benny was saying. You want to put those guys that aren't going to be highly owned everywhere else, but only if they have a good matchup. I've read articles all over the place where sometimes people just kind of put in guys just because they're low owned. And don't do that, because that's how you run into trouble. Don't just play a guy just because he's not going to be owned everywhere else. You still have to look for something, a good split, a good matchup. We don't like to throw darts, quote unquote, is what it's called. So be sure to do that. Be sure to make sure that the guys you're playing for the right reasons and not just because you just want to throw them in a lineup for the sake of it. The next question we had was from @the real Sham I Am, which is a great handle. I need to change mine to something like that. What are the keys in looking for the right stack, and is stacking recommended in cash games? I know personally I don't like to stack in cash game. Some guys on the same team, rather, I would like to like the guys hitting leadoff or third. It's okay to use 2 or 3 guys from one team. I think 3 is the max for me personally. But in terms of looking at how to find the right stack, you look at the opposing pitcher and his weakness, then look at certain guys in the top 5 or 6 of the opposing lineup that can exploit that. One good example is definitely the Tigers against left-handed pitching. It's because it's a right-handed lineup. The top 6 in that order usually are right-handed every time they face a left-handed pitcher. You're looking at guys like Rajai Davis, Ian Kinsler, Miguel Cabrera, both Martinez's, JD and Victor, and Yoenis Cespedes. They are all right-handed hitters. So if there's a bad left-handed pitcher on the mound, that's a stack you would want to target, something like that. I know a lot of other people have asked certain things that you don't want to do in cash games, and stacking is one of them. I think Benny can elaborate on that.
Yeah, and in cash games, stacking's a no-no. I mean, basically, the idea behind stacking is it creates a high variance type of play for you, meaning that you're linking a lot of guys together, hoping that team goes off. So you're really only hoping for, one event to happen, is that team goes off and scores 10 runs. Now, there's a whole bunch of probable outcomes to any baseball game. And if you don't get that outcome of 10 runs, you're going to lose all of your cash games if you're stacking in a cash game. To reiterate what Josh said, basically probably about 2 or 3 guys is the maximum amount of people you want from one team in a cash game. And that would only be if it's even like a great matchup. And even that is a little bit too many people for my liking to have in one game. I mean, the idea of a cash game is to take the safest plays. If there's 2 or 3 guys that you feel are the safest play at that position that happen to be on the same team, fine. I mean, there are a lot of times when I have 2 guys. 3 guys I really would only use if the 3rd guy that I'm using is somebody who's like an extreme value guy that's just, so cheap that you can't not use them. And it doesn't have to be somebody who's like min-priced. It could just be, like the other day when Nelson Cruz was in a great matchup and he was only 4,200. If you could find a guy who's just really, really underpriced in your opinion, then fine. You could throw him in there too as well. But I definitely don't think you should have too many more than that. But to answer the second part of that question about, what are the keys that you look for, I think Josh hit it right on the head. There are basically 2 things that I look for when I'm looking for a team that I want to stack. The first thing is the opposing pitcher of that team. If the guy on the other side of the mound that's going to be throwing to them is a guy who is prone to be getting lit up, is somebody who gives up a lot of home runs, somebody who gives up a lot of base runners, that's something that I want to do. That's somebody I want to target against. And the second thing I usually look for is ballpark as well. If you have that guy pitching in Colorado, if you have that guy pitching in Toronto, if you have that guy pitching in Philadelphia, if you have a guy who's a gas can that has been getting blown up before, you've seen that this guy has, games where he's given up 5 or 6 runs in 4 innings or something like that, and he's pitching in one of those places that's considered a hitter's ballpark. That's the things I look for when I'm trying to find the right stack to use. But again, stacking is something only for GPPs. If you have more than 2, maybe 3 guys in your cash game, then that's not the point of why you stack or the upside that you get out of stacking. You're basically giving yourself way too much risk in a cash game if you put more than 2 or 3 guys in your lineup.
For sure, and that actually leads us right to the next question, which is from M. Hombre Sports. When you stack on FanDuel, or I guess you could use it for DraftKings as well, do you typically take consecutive hitters like 1 through 4, or split it up maybe with 1, 3, 4, and 6? This is definitely a great question, and it's something that a lot of different people have different opinions on. Me personally, I like going with consecutive guys at the top of the order unless one player has a bad matchup. Like if there's a top lefty and you have a guy like Brandon Moss in 1 through 4, that might be a guy you stay away from if the rest of the guys are right-handed. But I like to use 1 through 4 or 2 through 5 or something of that nature, because this way you get the full exploitation of one-base inning. If you have a pitcher that gives up 2 hits in a row and then a 3-run home run, you're getting the points for all of those players. I know sometimes it can happen where a pitcher gets a walk and then a hit and then an out, then a hit and then a home run or something like that. But it's not likely that that would happen, because the more you watch baseball, the more you'll see it. If you see guys that get into trouble, it seems to happen all the time. It's hitting is contagious. That's what happened with the Tigers against lefty two weeks ago. They had 6 straight hits, including a home run. So I like to target the guys that are going to be hitting right after each other, because you get the runs, you get the RBI, and you get the bases for each base that each one of those hitters can put together. Benny, do you have something else you like to look at in terms of using 1 through 4, or do you like to split it up?
I mean, it really all depends on the situation for me. But let me give you an example of why I say it depends on the situation. There are some times where, like if I'm stacking, when I stacked the Marlins last week, I took the top 3 hitters. I took D. Gordon, I took Yelich, and then I took Stanton. I didn't like the guy that was hitting in 4th at the time, so there was no reason for me to go further than that. So I just took those 3 guys, 1, 2, 3. But there are other times when a lot of lineups, a lot of coaches right now will set up their lineup so it's lefty-righty, 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 lefty-righty. So that late in the game, if a team brings in a relief pitcher to specializes in, throwing to left-handed batters, when the next guy comes up, they're either going to have to go to the bullpen again and use up another pitcher, or they're going to have to put a guy who has a bad splits matchup, and let him pitch to the right-handed batter. So when you're making your lineups, you're also going to notice there might be, like today, a guy like Jeremy Guthrie gives up about a 300 batting average to left-handed batters with a lot of home runs, gives up a lot of fly balls, a lot of home runs to him. So if you're looking at a lineup today, well, what if the 5th batter what if you like the leadoff hitter who's a lefty and the 3rd hitter who's a lefty, and you like the cleanup hitter who's a lefty, but what if the 2nd batter is a right-handed batter and the 5th batter is a power lefty bat? Well, I would want that power lefty bat to be one of the guys that I included with any stack of that team that I put. So I may take the leadoff hitter and then 3, 4, 5. There are other times where you may skip the leadoff hitter and go like 2, 3, 4, and then skip the 5 hitter and go 6. So there are times for both, and it really all depends on the lineup. It depends on the splits. Basically, what I like to do is find a team that I want to target if I'm playing, and I'm going to stack up a couple hitters, and then I'll look and see, all right, who are the guys that I have to have and where are they hitting, and who are the other guys that I should include in there with them. Even if the 3rd and 5th hitter in that lineup are left-handed, and the 4th hitter's right-handed, doesn't have the perfect splits matchup, I'll still include him in there if he's a big batter, a guy that I think is going to, make some noise. Like you do that a lot of times with the Colorado Rockies. They might be facing a right-handed batter, a right-handed pitcher, so you got guys like Cargo and you got guys like Morneau in that lineup, and then you also want to throw Tulo in there because he hits between them, and then you might skip the 5th batter, which is Arenado, and throw in the 6th batter, which is Dickerson, because he has that lefty, matchup that you want. So I've done it and can see it both ways. It really all depends on what you're trying to accomplish with the guys that you're stacking together, in my opinion.
That's an excellent point. You can go both ways, and I think it depends on the situation, as always. But if you want to do stack things, remember not to do it in these 50-50s or head-to-heads. It's just for tournament play. Our next question comes from David A. Derby, and this is one definitely that Benny can elaborate on. How big of an impact do things like ballpark, weather, home field advantage, and opposing pitcher play into making your lineups?
I think all 4 of those things are absolutely huge, and I'll take them one by one to give you the reasons why. Weather is first, obviously. Whether you're playing a GPP or you're playing into all these cash games that we tell you guys to play in, you can't take a 0 and expect to win. It's just not something that's going to happen. Every once in a while you can get away with it if the rest of your team goes crazy, but you don't want to be taking multiple zeros. So if you have, a guy who's in a game that is looking likely not to play, I basically change him out for somebody safer. Remember, in cash games we want safety. So if there's a chance that one of the guys you're starting is not going to be able to play, you don't want to mess around with that kind of stuff. You want to basically, get another guy who may not be in as good a spot, but who is more likely to be able to play, and that's basically what you're looking for in those situations. Next, though, the other things that you mentioned, ballpark, home field advantage, opposing pitcher. Let me take the home field advantage one first. The home field advantage really doesn't matter to me Whether a guy's hitting at home or hitting away, it may matter a little more for pitchers, but not as much. I don't really think it's a huge thing in baseball. But what is important is the ballpark factor and what that ballpark factor means to that home field advantage. So, for example, if you're a pitcher for the San Diego Padres, you have a huge home field advantage every time you take the mound because San Diego is a pitcher's park. If you're a hitter on the Colorado Rockies, you have a home field advantage every time you play a home game because you play in a park that's a good hitter's park. So that kind of stuff is more important to me than whether or not they're home or away. If every park was neutral and they were all built the same way, I probably wouldn't care so much about whether guys were home or away. It might be a slight bump, but not anything that I'm really going to take, too much into consideration when I'm making my lineups. But the park factor is definitely something that you want to consider, and it definitely is something that's real and important. If you have guys playing in Toronto, if you have guys playing in Philly, if you have guys playing in Colorado, those are all places where you really want to make sure that, those bats are in your lineup because, frankly, if you look at the numbers over the years, those places just yield more hits, they yield more runs. It's just better for your fantasy team. You want to try to put guys on your lineup that are in the best spots to succeed, and all those guys are guys that are, going to be in the best spots to succeed playing at those places. And the last thing that you mentioned is opposing pitcher. As you know, every day I always mention pitchers who I'm targeting against. Targeting against is basically what we mean by the opposing pitcher. You want to find the guy who you think is going to give up a lot of runs, and then you want to find the guys who are most likely to have a hand in scoring those runs or helping your team score those runs. If you can put all those things together and you get a guy who checks off all those boxes, those are pretty much the guys that Josh and I try to mention every day as guys that we consider to be must-plays. Good park, good opposing pitcher who they should be able to hit off of. The weather's nice out there for him that day. I mean, they're all important things and they're all positive. But if I had to rank them in order, I'd probably say opposing pitcher's most important, ballpark is second, making sure that the weather's okay, which actually technically may be first. As long as the weather's okay, that's not that important, though. And then whether or not they have home field advantage, honestly, really doesn't matter much to me.
Yeah, I agree on all points, and I definitely think that it's a thing to look at rather than home and away. You have to look at that ballpark. We could just reiterate, if a guy is home, I can't give him a bump because he's at home. But if it's the Coors Field, Rogers Center, like you said, Citizens Bank Park, or Petco, you can give him a bump up or down depending on the park factor. But that doesn't really matter if he's home or away. It just matters where the game is played. It could be, and it won't happen anymore, but it could be a neutral site, and it would still matter based on the park factor. So be sure to take that into account. And we have our last question today. It's a fun one from John Cupo. Who's the best MLB player who will not make the Hall of Fame? Real quick, I'm just going to go with Adrian Beltre. He had 2,600 hits, almost 400 home runs, still has a good few years left. If he gets to 3,000, he'll probably get in, but not a lot of people are talking about him. Real quick, who's your guy, Benny?
The guys who I think go under the radar the most when it comes to things like the Hall of Fame are the guys who are at the top of the order, solid players that just get a lot of hits, get on base, score a lot of runs, consistent players. Like, I hated the whole Craig Biggio argument. Oh, he's not a Hall of Famer. I mean, yeah, you're right. The guy was a compiler. He played for a long time. But still, there's a lot of guys who played for a long time and didn't get as many hits as he did or score as many runs as he did. So one guy who falls in that, and is a guy I use all the time in my cash games, a guy who I probably love more than most. But Matt Carpenter's that kind of guy for me if he keeps going on this, the career path that he's going on. He gets around 180, 200 hits every year. He scores about 115, 120 runs, and it's not sexy. He's not a big home run hitter. He hasn't won any batting titles like a Tony Gwynn or a Wade Boggs. Like if Tony Gwynn and Wade Boggs don't win all those batting titles, there's a chance that those guys might not be mentioned in the Hall of Fame. And to me, those guys are great baseball players. I mean, that's the kind of baseball player. If my kid could grow up to be half of the baseball player that Tony Gwynn was, I would be pretty happy with it. Those are the kind of guys you want your kids to emulate. Even like I'm sure you're going to hear the argument in another couple of years about a guy I love and Derek Jeter. Like, guys like that, they don't get the love all the time by the Hall of Fame because they don't have the sexy stats. They're not the big home run hitters, but those are solid guys that if they're playing on your favorite baseball team, they're guys that you love and you want as many of those guys on your team as possible.
No doubt. That wraps up our mailbag for today. Each show or each week, we're going to try to do a mailbag. So if you guys have anything you want us to touch on, be sure to let us know in the chat right now on RotoCurve. You can find that at the bottom of the right-hand screen. Or you can just get at us on the forums. You can find us both on Twitter. We'll talk about that later. But for now, let's get into the bulk of the show. And and talk about who we're targeting for today. Benny, I know we probably agree on some pitchers. We always seem to do, which could be good or bad, but usually it's or hopefully it's a good thing for today. Do you have any guys that you're using specifically in cash?
Specifically in cash, yes. There's actually a lot of pitching options today. I'm going to tell you guys something that I was considering last night. There are pitching options everywhere today. So today actually might be a day where instead of building your lineup by starting with your pitching, kind of start building it by starting with your hitters. Put in all the hitters that you really want, and then see what that leaves you over for pitching. One guy, I did that yesterday, and one guy who I keep coming back to right now is Bartolo Colon. And I know that when you look at Bartolo Colon and you think about Bartolo Colon, you don't understand how he does what he does, because I don't understand how he does what he does. He doesn't throw the ball particularly hard. He does have solid control, but I mean, you look at this guy and you watch him pitch, and I have no idea how he's been able to have as much success as he has in the last 2 years. And basically, he's going, every time he gets on the mound, he's going 6 or 7 innings. He's striking out somewhere between 5 and 8 batters, and he's not giving up any runs. He's not giving up a lot of hits. He doesn't really walk anybody, and it just amazes me that that he has been able to do what he does. Today, he gets the Marlins. The Marlins have the second most strikeouts so far this year against right-handed pitching. They're playing in Citi Field, which is one of the best parks in the majors for pitchers. So he does have a lot going in his way. Like I said, he doesn't throw the ball particularly hard, so he doesn't really get tired. He's an older guy, so they will let him go 110, 120 pitches if they need him to. And he's basically just real solid. I think he's going to get you about 7 innings today. He's going to get you somewhere around like 6 strikeouts today. If he picks up the win, he's going to get you, 16 to 18 points on FanDuel. He's going to get you a number in the low 20s on DraftKings. And on DraftKings, he's only 7,000. On FanDuel, I think he's 8,400. I think it's reasonable prices today for Bartolo Colon. He's probably not my top pitcher on the day. I don't think he's going to be the guy who gets the top overall score, but for cash games, I think he's really safe, and I think at the price that he's at, he's going to be one of the best values at the end of the day.
So it's an excellent point. I was looking at him as well, but like you said, it's what you watch him pitch and you look at what he does, and it's just confusing. But like we always say, you have to respect the result. If he's getting you those fantasy points, that's all that matters at the end of the day. 2 guys that I'm using in my 50-50s and head-to-heads, which are cash games, are Michael Wacha and Corey Kluber. First, Wacha is my top pitcher of the day in terms of using it in these safe cash games because he's not dramatically priced. He's not as cheap as Bartolo Colon is, but he's not up with Kershaw's around 12,000 or Max Scherzer. But what I like about Wacha is he's the favorite in a low-scoring game. Now, obviously, we talked about the lines earlier, so that has a lot to do with Cueto as well. But he faces a Reds offense who has struck out the 5th most top often in the MLB this year, and they're only hitting just .218 as a team with a ton of ground balls. Wacha is a ground ball pitcher. He throws the ball hard, he throws the ball downhill, and it's tough to get a lot of hits off him if he's not keeping that ball up. So that's one thing you want to target in DraftKings because pitchers that don't give up a lot of hits aren't going to get a lot of negative points towards their score, and that can give you more than 20. If he gets a win, he can get to 24. Throw in a few strikeouts, and if he has a nice game, you're looking at one of the top pitchers on the day. I like to pair him with Corey Kluber because he's a favorite against Pelfrey, who is probably one of the worst pitchers on this slate. There's going to be a reason why that line is so high because of the runs allowed by Mike Pelfrey. I also like Kluber because he strikes a lot of people out, one of the highest rates in the MLB last year and so far this year. He faces the Twins, who scored a little bit yesterday, but they're still one of the worst offenses in baseball, at least statistically. One guy I do like in tournament play is Jimmy Nelson. You're going to see him a lot in tournament games today because he has a great matchup against the Pirates, I believe. What he can do is he's cheaper than Kershaw. He's cheaper than Scherzer, cheaper than Kluber, and he can give you that cap room you needed to spend on top bats if we're going to use him in tournament play. He performed well in his first start, over 20 points on FanDuel, over 30 on DraftKings. And if he can get a few strikeouts and have a good, successful start with 6 or more innings, you're looking at points in an unexpected place from a cheap pitcher. Then you can use the rest of that cap room for hitters like Tulowitzki, who's cheap today. But if you're using him, as Benny said, if you want to get cute in your lineups, you can have him, you can have Nelson. You can spend up on that Dodgers stack, which we might talk about in a little while.
Yeah, and I have to agree with Kluber. Let me ask you a question, Josh, because this is something I've been struggling with. I really kind of like Kluber on DraftKings. He's 9,800, I think. But on FanDuel, I think he's 10,700 is his price. Do you think that's a little too high today for him, or do you think that works, still works for you even on FanDuel?
He has that great upside, which makes him worth a play at that price. But the problem is, you only get one pitcher on FanDuel. So if he's not worth that 10,700 at the end of the day, that could crush your lineup. Especially if you could spend a little bit more for Kershaw. Now he does face a tough lineup, but he's still Clayton Kershaw. You could get Waka. You could get Max Scherzer for a similar price. I think I would rather spend money on guys like that than have a little bit of a flyer and overpay for a guy like Kluber, who has been great. He's one of the better pitchers in baseball last year. But it's still not to that skill level of these other guys, especially with the matchups that they could potentially have.
Yeah, and that kind of brings me to the point that I was going to bring up. The other pitcher that I wanted to talk about today is Max Scherzer. I think that the people who really want to pay up are going to go and get Kershaw, and I think that a lot of people are going to be on Kluber too because he seems like kind of like a value play almost today because he's not too expensive on DraftKings, and he also lets you save a little bit of money if you're on FanDuel. Scherzer is a little more expensive. He's sandwiched between those two guys. He gets the Phillies today, who have been struggling all season long. They're not a very good hitting team. And I think that he's going to be in line for a pretty good game. So he's the other guy who I've been using in some of my cash games where I've been able to afford to pay up. I don't know if I would use him over on FanDuel, but I do have him in some of my DraftKings. Him and Bartolo Colon put together wind up coming out to about the $18,000 to $19,000 that I like to spend on my pitching altogether. So I think that those two are a combination that you could use. But I do like Kluber as well, Wakas as well. I mean, like I said, there's a lot of pitchers in play tonight. I mean, we didn't even really talk about Kershaw. I think it's mostly because of price. That's really why I'm off him. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. The reason why I'm probably going to stay away from him is, although he's the best pitcher in baseball right now, I still truly believe that. There have been rumors about struggles in the playoffs, and that's a story for another day. But he is the top pitcher in baseball, and he's worth paying for, but not against the Rockies. They're still a very good hitting team, and I can't take that risk because if he's not getting you over 20 fantasy points, he's not meeting value, which we talk about, and that could go a long way because then you're relying on home runs to bring you to that cash point in your 50-50s, and that's just a hard thing to do.
Yeah, well, I know that you don't want to play against Kershaw in that game, but would you consider playing against Kyle Kendrick in that game? I know you had a catcher from there that you really liked, right?
Yeah, certainly. Being a Phillies fan for as long as I can remember, I unfortunately had the pleasure, I guess you could say, of watching Kyle Kendrick pitch almost every 5 days for about 6 or 7 years. And he helps in terms of daily fantasy because he gives you the ability to stack a team against them in your tournament games and actually in your cash games. I'm looking at 2 or 3 Dodgers today. First is Yasmani Grandal, which is the catcher for the Dodgers. He's a left-handed hitter. He's facing Kendrick, who we just talked about, who struggles mightily against lefties. He always has. I'm targeting Grandal with the other Dodgers lefties today because Kendrick is a sinker baller, which doesn't bode too well with lefties who have a natural uppercut swing. For those of you who watch a lot of baseball and you hear the term wheelhouse, and that's exactly what happens with sinker ballers. If they get that ball not off the plate a little bit, it's right in those wheelhouse for those lefties. And Grandal and guys like we'll talk about later, if Andre Ethier plays, I'm targeting both of them. Do you have a catcher that you are looking at for both your cash and GPP lineups?
Yeah, I'm actually using the same guy pretty much across the board tonight, and that's Jonathan Lucroy. He gets Jeff Locke, who's a left-handed pitcher for Pittsburgh. Locke gave up about a .275 batting average last season to right-handed batters, and Lucroy is a guy who hits left-handed pitching pretty well. He hit about 300 last year, I think a little over 300, like 304 against left-handed pitching last season. And the other thing I really like about Lucroy is a lot of catchers, if you look, you don't have a lot of options for catchers that bat in that top part of the order. Most catchers are going to be hitting in the 7 or 8 hole. Guys who have a little bit of power you might see in the 6 hole, like a guy like a Mike Zunino. Very few catchers that you're going to get that hit right in the meat of the order. And Lucroy has actually been batting second for the Brewers this year. So he hits in front of guys like Ryan Braun, which means he's going to see a lot of pitches. You're not going to want to walk a guy like that and put him on base. You'd probably rather take your chances with letting him take his hacks. And even if he does get on base, he also has those big bats behind him. The guys like Braun and Aramis Ramirez. Even Adam Lynn this year, who's not much of a power guy in my opinion, but he's a very solid hitter. He gets on base a lot. He, makes a lot of base hits, puts a lot of balls in the gap for, doubles and stuff like that. So having a guy like Lucroy, who's a high on base percentage guy, good batting average against left-handed pitching, and hitting in the 2 hole, and playing a position that's tough to fill in catcher, makes him somebody today that I think you want to look at for your lineups. He's also not very expensive. I'm looking it up right now. He's $3,500 on FanDuel. and 3,800 on DraftKings. So on DraftKings, I think he's one of like the top 3 or 4 price catchers, and on FanDuel, I think he's somewhere around like 6th or 7th. But again, that's not a ton of money to be spending when you look at other positions and you look at the guys that you can get at some of the other positions for around that money. He's comparable to some of those guys. So I think it makes sense to pay up a little bit for Lucroy today. But again, going back to picking on Kendrick, I know you have a first baseman from that same Dodgers game that you like as well, right?
Yeah, Adrian Gonzalez is my guy at first base today. He's absolutely on fire right now, just hitting everything. He's hitting everything hard, and it's not even the fact that he could potentially hit a home run or a double that is why I like him. That's just a plus at this moment. Anytime he gets on base, which Kyle Kendrick is likely to give up a lot of base runners, he can score with guys the way guys are behind him. If he gets a few hits, he's going to drive in guys in front of him, like Jimmy Rollins. Adrian Gonzalez has a ton of protection in that lineup, and he has a ton of guys on base in front of him. So he has a ton of different ways to score, which is not really an easily thing to do with first baseman because usually they're just power guys. If they hit a home run, you get 14 points. But Gonzalez can hit the ball into the gap and get 5 points on DraftKings. He gets on base, which keeps him out of the negatives on FanDuel. And with the guys behind him and in front of him, he's an excellent guy to target, especially at first base, because he's still underpriced on some sites compared to the value he's been spreading out. Benny, do you have another first baseman?
Yeah, and again, I want to go over this based on site because I agree with Josh. I really like Adrian Gonzalez. As you guys know, he's somebody who I talk about, often. On DraftKings, he's 4,900. I definitely think he's somebody that's usable. The guy who I'm using a lot today is also Freddie Freeman. Freeman is 4,700 on DraftKings, so their prices are pretty close, and I would have no problem going up and taking Gonzalez instead because I think he does have a better matchup. But Freeman doesn't have a horrible matchup either. He gets Drew Hutchinson from Toronto. They're up in the Rogers Center. The Rogers Center is a place that yields a lot of home runs, a lot of hits, a lot of runs, so it's a very good hitter's park that you could use. The other thing I like about that matchup is Hutchinson basically struggles a little bit with left-handed power bats. He gave up, I think, 17 home runs to guys from that side of the plate last year. The batting average wasn't incredibly high, but it was higher than normal as well. So if you're going to target somebody against a pitcher like that, the guy who you should probably use is a left-handed power bat. So for that Atlanta lineup, you're getting a park bump with Freeman by going up to the Rogers Center from Turner Field. And like I said, he's a guy that has some power. He's hitting third in that order. He's in a good spot today. He's in a good stadium. But here's where I really wanted to get into it. On DraftKings, he's 4,700. So for $200 more, you can go up to Adrian Gonzalez, who to me seems like a much better play. But if you look over on FanDuel, Adrian Gonzalez on FanDuel is $5,000. A guy like Freddie Freeman on FanDuel is only $3,500. So Freeman is the 14th most expensive first baseman today over on FanDuel, whereas Adrian Gonzalez is the most expensive first baseman on both of those sites. So as much as I love Adrian Gonzalez, when I'm building my FanDuel lineups, I paid up a little bit for pitching today in some of these spots, so I wasn't able to fit a guy like Adrian Gonzalez into my lineup. So if you're looking for a guy who has a similar, situation today and has similar type upside for a little bit cheaper, it's probably Freddie Freeman to me in cash. I just can't pay $5,000 for Adrian Gonzalez on FanDuel. Over on DraftKings, though, where there's a $200 price difference, 4,900 versus 4,700. It's Adrian Gonzalez all day to me over there. I agree 100%. But that's something that you got to think about is the price that these guys are and what it allows you to do with the rest of your roster. I know moving on to second base, like I said, I live in the New York area. I am not a fan of Mike Pelfrey at all. I'm more of a Yankees fan than a Mets fan, so I don't hate him as much as some of my friends do. But I know you had a second baseman you said you were targeting against Pelfrey today, right?
Yeah, Jason Kipnis for the Cleveland Indians. Pelfrey has been a target for years. As long as Daily Fantasy's been around, every time that he pitches, we're looking at guys that are facing him. And Kipnis is the guy for me today. He's a left-handed bat who faces Pelfrey. Pelfrey has allowed lefties to hit 280, which is high. It's not as abnormal as the slugging percentage he allows, which is something I'd like to touch on. A guy that gives up a high slugging percentage, which a slugging percentage is, for those of you who don't know, it's basically the bases divided by at-bats. So what that teaches us is if you have a slugging percentage of 500, that means you're getting a base every 2 at-bats or a half a base per at-bat. So if you're facing guys who give up a high slugging percentage, it gives a higher chance to get extra base hits, which, as we know, is definitely something we like to target. Kipnis is a guy that can hit the ball out of the ballpark. He can drive the ball into the gaps for extra bases. And Pelfrey has allowed a high slugging percentage to lefties, and that's exactly why I'm targeting Kipnis and other left-handed batters in that Cleveland order. I know you have another guy at second base that is also a little bit of a price difference on two sites. Is there somebody that you'd want to target there to kind of free up some room in your lineup?
Yeah, last night when I started building my lineups, I actually started on FanDuel. I usually start on DraftKings, so it was something a little different. And the guy who I wound up putting in my lineups where I needed a little bit of salary relief was Jonathan Schoop from Baltimore. And he's been absolutely on fire lately. I think he's 6 of his last 18 with 3 home runs. So he's somebody who's seeing the ball well and is hitting the ball well. He has a pretty good matchup today. They get Joe Kelly, who's not great again. He actually has reverse splits, so right-handed batters tend to knock him around a little bit better than left-handers do. So a guy like Schoop is somebody who's definitely in play for me on FanDuel at 2,700. Now, after I was done making my FanDuel lineup, though, I went over to DraftKings, and Jonathan Schoop is up to about $4,000. Over on DraftKings, I can't play this guy at $4,000. There are at least a half a dozen other second basemen who hit in the top of the order, are in just as good a spot or better, and are somewhere between 3,800, 3,600, and 42 or 4,300. So for a couple $100 more or a couple $100 less, I can get somebody who's probably going to have a better at bat, at least an extra at bat. Might be playing in a better park. I mean, there are literally 4 or 5 or 6 guys who I'm going to have to reconsider because I just can't get myself to pay $4,000, no matter how hot he's been, for a hitter who's probably going to be, I don't know, probably hit 7th in that lineup today maybe. So to me, it doesn't make much sense. But basically, it brings me to the teaching point I wanted to let you guys know about today. If you have a guy that you like and he's cheaper on one site than he is on the other, and you play on more than one site, then use him on the site he's cheap on. Like I said, I like Adrian Gonzalez on DraftKings. He's in my DraftKings lineup. But if I'm going to put him in my FanDuel lineup, I'm going to wind up having to take 2 or 3 guys in that $2,400 to $2,800 range, and I don't really like doing that on most days because those $2,400 to $2,800 players, you're always going to have 1 or 2 of them in your lineup, but if you have a lineup that has too many of those guys, I really feel like you're limiting yourself, especially in cash games. You don't want too many. You want certainty in cash games. You don't want too many things that are uncertain. So if you're paying up over there, you're going to need a guy like Schoop in order to fit in some of the studs that you want to pay up for. But on DraftKings, where he's $4,000, he's not a value play anymore over there. So on DraftKings, I definitely wouldn't use him. But on FanDuel, he's definitely somebody I think is in play.
Yeah, that brings us to third base, which there's a guy that call me crazy, Benny, but I'm starting third baseman against Kershaw, and it's not Arenado. It's DJ LeMahieu on DraftKings is eligible at third base, and his price has come up a little bit, but he's facing Kershaw. And for those of you familiar with DraftKings, they are changing their prices based on pitching matchups this year, which is something we touched on yesterday. Or on Wednesday's show. But what I like about LeMahieu is this guy's on fire lately, and not many people will be on him because of Kershaw. This dude's hitting over 500, I believe, right now. When he was in college, he led the nation in hitting. This guy's just hit everywhere he's gone. And Kershaw, although like I said earlier, he's the best pitcher in baseball, he can give up some hits, as we've seen earlier this year. And LeMahieu's one of those guys that he swings the bat well, and you're going to get him for cheap at third base. I believe he's $3,200 on DraftKings. So if you can get spending up on pitching, which is definitely advised today with the talent you have, I'm targeting a guy like LeMahieu, although he is hitting in the bottom of the lineup. The guy's just been on fire lately. Do you have any third baseman that you're using in GPP specifically, or are you just targeting some safer guys at that position today?
Well, I have 2 guys that I've been using. The one guy who I actually have in cash, again, we're kind of switching roles here at third base, because the guy that I have that I'm using in my cash games today is more of a home run hitter, and that's Aramis Ramirez. Aramis Ramirez from Milwaukee absolutely crushes left-handed pitching. I mean, it's his preferred split, it's where he does his most damage, and it's what he really likes to see. And the thing that I like the most about it is it's also where most of his power is coming from these days. Most of his power is coming against left-handed pitching and bad left-handed pitching at that point. But basically, Jeff Locke is not a horrible left-handed pitcher, but he's also not great. He's not somebody that I'm going to be scared of using guys against. So the guy who I've been rolling out most is Aramis Ramirez. Hopefully he hits 4th or 5th, or maybe, at worst, I want him hitting 5th. I'm hoping they don't drop him to 6th behind Chris Davis in the lineup today. But, even then, I still think that the splits matchup is good enough that I'm going to have to use him and put him in. On FanDuel, I actually had been using a little bit of a guy named Kelly Johnson as well. Johnson is a left-handed batter from Atlanta. He's basically the same situation that applies to Freddie Freeman. He's getting Drew Hutchinson, gives up a lot of home runs to left-handed batters. They're playing in the Rogers Center. And Kelly Johnson is really cheap. I think he's only $2,400 over on FanDuel. And he is hitting in that 5-hole, or he has been hitting in that 5-hole for Atlanta right now. So if you can get a guy in a good RBI position, a guy who can drive in some runs, playing in a good ballpark, chance for a home run in that ballpark, and playing against a pitcher who the splits are in his favor, I think that might be a guy that's worth using as a salary saver. So he's the guy that I've been using as a salary saver. And just so you know, I don't think your DJ pick at third base is all that crazy against Kershaw, because you're going to get my crazy pick at shortstop in a minute. But before we get into that, let me hear who you like at shortstop.
I'm going to be targeting Kyle Kendrick again. He's facing a former teammate and a guy I like, shortstop, Jimmy Rollins. The switch hitter, so he always gets the benefit of the doubt. So if Kendrick does get chased from the ball game, he's going to have an opportunity to face those relievers from either side of the plate. He has a looping swing from the left side, a little bit different than his right-handed swing, but that's perfect against sinker ballers, as we talked about earlier. But one reason why I like Rollins today is we always went over, I know Benny talked about the catchers in terms of stealing bags, but I like to look at pitchers as well. Kyle Kendrick is hesitant in his delivery from the stretch, which means with guys on base, he has a little bit of some hesitation when he brings his knee up in the air, and it gives you that extra split second, which is the difference of being safe. So Rollins can steal some bags, he can move around the bases. You're getting that bonus on DraftKings and FanDuel if he can steal a bag. He can get on base 3 or 4 times, and he has opportunity to hit 5 or 6 times, especially against Kendrick. He has the opportunity to give up a ton of runs. So I'm using a guy like Jimmy Rollins who has upside, and he's safe because he's a leadoff hitter in a great lineup. I can see your shortstop here, and I'm definitely going to be listening. I want to hear exactly what you have to say. What do you think about Mr. Lowry?
Well, to be honest, there are 2 guys that I'm using in cash, and then the other guy, the one who I said you might be a little shocked of, is the GPP play. But the 2 guys I'm using in cash are Lowry is one of them. He gets a matchup today with Yovani Gallardo. Gallardo is not a very good pitcher. He gives up a lot of fly balls. He gives up a lot of home runs. And the thing I like about Lowry is he's hitting right in the middle of that order. I think that game is going to turn into a little bit of a shootout. So if it does turn into a shootout, you got the guy that's hitting in the 3 spot. He's got a chance to drive in some of the guys in front of him. He's got a chance for the guys behind him to drive him in. So he's going to score some runs. He's going to get some RBIs. He should pick up a hit or 2 today. And like I said, I don't really like Gallardo. He's somebody who I will, try to target against. So that's one of the 2 guys I'm using in cash. The other guy is Gene Segura. And again, it all depends on price. It all depends where you're playing. He is actually batting leadoff now with Carlos Gomez out. So he's a leadoff hitter. He's playing against a left-handed pitcher like Locke. He hits pretty well against the lefties. He's in the number 1 hole. He's got guys like Lucroy and Braun and all the other big bats on Milwaukee who we mentioned hitting behind him. And he's still a little bit cheap because he hasn't really adjusted to the fact that he's the new number 1 hitter. 2 years ago, last year he didn't have a great season, but 2 years ago he was one of the top 3 or 4 statistical shortstops in all of fantasy baseball for the season. So he's definitely a guy that has some upside. He has a little bit of home run pop. He can steal bases. He's got upside, and those are the 2 guys who I think are the safest that I've been rolling out in most of my cash games. But for GPPs, the big play of the day for me, I think Tulowitzki has a chance to have a really big day today against Kershaw. That's the shocking moment of the day for me, and here's the reason why. Tulo absolutely smashes left-handed pitching. Now, I realize Clayton Kershaw is not your average left-handed pitcher, but Clayton Kershaw 2015 so far hasn't been the same as Clayton Kershaw 2014. I don't think anything's wrong with him. I don't think he eventually won't right the ship, but I also don't think it's something that usually happens overnight. He's been making a few too many mistakes, leaving a few too many balls over the plate. And again, the thing that Tulo can do as a right-handed batter, if a left-handed pitcher leaves the ball over the middle of the plate, he sees the ball so well against lefties that he's going to give it a ride. It's not a good hitter's ballpark. There's a lot of negatives that are in his way. And that's actually why I will use him in GPPs, because I think people are going to say, oh, I'm not going against Kershaw, oh, I'm not starting Tulo in Dodger Stadium. But that's the reason why you would do it. If you can get one of the best hitters at his position, which is a tough position to fill, for a discounted price because he's down to 4,100 on DraftKings, which is the cheapest I have ever seen Tulo on DraftKings. And nobody else is going to be playing him. He has the upside where he could go yard. He could go yard twice and, basically wind up winning you a tournament today because you're going to get Tulo at 4,100, less than probably 5 or 6% owned, because I don't think a lot of people are going to go down that route. So that's my crazy GPP play for today. Again, do not use him in cash games. In cash games, go with the Lowry, go with the Rollins, go with the Segura. Those are the guys who you should be using in cash. But to get into what somebody had asked earlier today, if you're trying to get cute in a GPP and you want to play with upside, I think Tulo might be that guy today at only 4,100 on DraftKings. But anyway, let's get back to the real point of why we're here, to help you guys win some money in your cash game. So who do you like in the outfield today, Josh? Who's the guy that you're going to be going with?
If Andre Ethier is in the lineup against Kendrick, once again, we're talking about another guy against Kyle Kendrick. He's a good play because of his price. He's probably the Yasiel Puig is back today from what I've read, but he could play instead of Carl Crawford. If he does play, he has that good matchup against a right-handed pitcher who's not very excellent on the mound. But if he doesn't play, I'm looking at guys like spending on Bryce Harper against Sean O'Sullivan. I'm also looking at Michael Bourne against Pelfrey because Pelfrey gives up a ton of hits, and Bourne also has that upside in terms of stolen bases. So if I can fit a guy like Andre Ethier, I'm definitely going to be targeting him. But if he's out, I'm going to have to use Bourne and probably find one of those value plays at another position, like a Segura, like a Jimmy Rollins, or even use LeMahieu everywhere at third base. Who's your guy in the outfield? Is there one guy you're targeting specifically?
Well, the one guy who makes the most sense to me, looking at the matchups and everything, is Josh Reddick from Oakland. Reddick is a left-handed batter. He hit about 300 last year with 12 home runs and about 240 at-bats against right-handed pitching. And today he gets a matchup with Jeremy Guthrie. Guthrie is one of the worst right-handed pitchers against left-handed power bats. He gave up 297 batting average with about 19 home runs, I think, against left-handers last year. So if you put the two of those things together, you got a guy who's, basically hits right-handers really well, and you got a right-handed pitcher who basically struggles against left-handed hitters, especially power hitters. You put all that together, you're going to wind up in a good spot. Just a couple other guys I want to mention. Michael Kadire, he gets David Phelps, who struggles with right-handed batters. Kadire hits right-handed pitching pretty well. Not the greatest ballpark, but he's a guy who I think could go under the radar, bat, and clean up for the Mets right now. Two of the other guys are the guys that we mentioned the other night. And Adam Jones is absolutely on fire right now. He's 12 for his last 21 with 4 home runs. He has a pretty good matchup. He gets Kelly in a high-scoring game. He hits righties pretty well. Kelly struggles against right-handed batters. So I think there's a lot going in Adam Jones' favor again for today. That Orioles team might be a little bit sneaky, put up a couple runs today. And then the last guy is Nelson Cruz. Nelson Cruz, he's been bringing his boomstick every night right now. Gallardo is a guy who basically Milwaukee got rid of because he gives up too many home runs. So you take a guy who's been smashing home runs, you get a pitcher who gives up too many of them, you put the two of them together. Gallardo struggles a little bit with right-handers, even though he is righty, and I think Nelson Cruz could be in a spot to get another home run today. So basically that's the rundown for today. That gives you guys every position. So Josh, why don't you tell the people a little bit about how you're going to be building those lineups today and who you're going to be targeting?
We always talk about that 90-10 split that we like to play, and you can read more about that on rotocurve.com. And the 90-10 split is 90% in these cash games, in these 50-50s, and the 10% is in GPP. So I'm going to have a few lineups today. My GPP lineup is going to have a Dodgers stack, which for obvious reasons, I talked about a ton of bats against Kendrick, and Jimmy Nelson, so I can afford that stack. But in cash games, in these 50-50s, I love Corey Kluber, I love Michael Walker, and I'm going to be filling in from there. I'm going to look at some cheap guys, probably like LeMahieu, like Josh Reddick a lot, especially after hearing you touch on those numbers. But if Ethier doesn't start, he's filling up my lineup as a cheap guy. I'm going to have to target another guy in the outfield. But right now, my main lineups are going to have Corey Kluber, Michael Wacha, and a bunch of value guys at the plate. I probably will spend on my one big bat in Adrian Gonzalez. I think he's the play of the day for me today. What are you doing in your lineups tonight?
It's been different. So far, I started building some lineups on DraftKings. I started building some lineups on FanDuel, and I started looking at Fantasy Aces. And I feel like the pricing in the industry right now is so different that the guys that I'm using on all those sites are kind of different. There are a couple of them, though, who I have in just about every lineup, so those are the guys I'll hit on. Again, like Josh just said, Josh Reddick is one of those guys. Jean Segura at shortstop is another guy who I've been using. I feel like I've been using quite a bit today. My catcher, Lucroy, has been in just about all my lineups. I have a lot of Bartolo Colon exposure. I think Bartolo is still a little bit too cheap. Again, I can't explain to you how he's able to do this and other guys aren't, because he doesn't throw particularly hard. He doesn't have, really nasty breaking stuff. It's not like it's coming at you and dropping off the table or anything like that, but the guy just keeps racking up strikeouts. He can pitch all day. He goes deep into games. So I have a lot of Bartolo Colon. I've also been using Scherzer a lot, which means that I do need some of those value plays. Been throwing in some of the Kelly Johnson, some of the Shoop. Like I said, you got to get some guys with some upside that could also make it work for you. And that's basically how I've been going about it so far. I think that there's going to be a game or two that either gets rained out tonight or, gets pushed back and you got to worry about it. So please, everybody, make sure you keep an eye on that stuff, because that could change a lot of things for you. Like I said, there's a couple Mets that I mentioned there, so that's one of the games that I'm really looking at. And just looking out my window here, it's a little bit dreary. I'm over in the northeast part of the country, so some of the games that are up here today may have some rain issues. So just keep an eye on that.
Yeah, for sure. And that brings us to the top of the hour. Thanks for another great show. We will see you on Tuesday, April 21st at noon Eastern Time. Be sure to check out RotoCurve on Twitter. Follow myself at Josh Kalachi and Benny at BennyR11. Be sure to find us in the forums. You can click on the chat and bottom right hand of your screen. Somebody will always be there. For Benny Mushardi, I am Josh Kalachi, and this was The Curve. And as always, Benny has something to say.
That's right. Stay classy, DFS. We love you guys. Be good.